Superman Returns is such an interesting animal. This movie came out, man, just months before, I mean, really, actually just weeks before I stepped down from the worship pastor position I was serving in back in 2006 when this movie came out. And so it was just months before I would have started kind of reviewing movies. And so I never got around to doing a Superman Returns review. At the time, I had mixed feelings about it, and I still do. I feel like it's an overly and unnecessarily committed love letter to the first two Superman movies that Christopher Reeve did. And at first, that commitment was sweet and charming, hot on the heels of watching Supermans 1 through 4. But before long, it feels at odds with itself, this movie, and the movies that it tries to honor. It's trying to, in a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, inconsistent way, say that it's part of the continuity of some of the Christopher Reeve movies, namely in that Superman slept with Lois in Superman 2. And so that's like the key thing that's brought out. But I mean, Clark's mom is said to have passed away in Superman 3, and she's not dead in this movie. And so that's another reason why the dividing line clearly seems to be after Superman 2. But I mean, there's all kinds of like technological things that he's supposed to have only been gone for 5 years, and yet suddenly it's 2006 and not the mid 80s or something. And so there's definitely some things that you have to kind of squint and ignore and in order to fit this in with the continuity. And that's problem enough. But I think just thematically and in terms of the character of the script, the story, the different virtues and ideas, the dramatic weight that it's going for, it just feels inconsistent with what it's trying to say it's a part of. One of the main problems for me is Superman as basically an absentee father. Now, if it wasn't obvious from the beginning, I'm talking spoilers with all these movies, but I mean, we learn, it's confirmed basically at the end of this movie, that Lois's son, Jason, whom she says throughout the movie is her fiance's child, her fiance Richard's child, is actually Superman's child. But that means that even though he didn't mean to be, he became this absentee father who missed the first 5 years of his son's life. And he's not necessarily a bad guy for doing that, but it does basically point to one of the failings, I think, that even Margot Kidder now, in years later, I can't remember if Margot Kidder's passed away or not, but she said in interviews decades later that now she would go back, she said, and side with the prudes, as she said, that Superman and Lois should not have slept together. That in that way they should have maintained kind of a traditional moral fiber for Superman when it comes to sexual activity. And it just it kind of highlights that. It's like what in the second movie was treated as just kind of harmless free love culture. We see, oh, well, it resulted in a pregnancy that Lois had that he didn't know about, and so a child without its actual father for the first 5 years of its life, okay? That is one of the less severe fallouts of sexual promiscuity, and there can be ones that are so much worse, but that's already severe enough in itself. And so it's just kind of lumping Superman in with a bunch of stories that are all too common today of broken families and dysfunctional families, many of which are rooted in some way in immoral or sinful sexual behavior, you know. So, yeah, Superman, absentee father, bothers me. Also, when Superman is trying to kind of rekindle his connection or romance with Lois, and she is still hurting from the fact that he left, he strikes me as trying to manipulate her into feeling something again when he meets with her on the rooftop and asks if she will fly with him because he wants to show her something, you know, because she wrote this piece about how the world doesn't need a Superman. He wants to take her up. Ultimately, we find he wants to take her up into the lower atmosphere or above the clouds anyway, and say, like, what do you hear? She doesn't hear anything. He says, I hear it all. You say the world doesn't need a savior, but every day I hear them crying out for one. So that was ostensibly what he ultimately took her on the flight for. But you see, as soon as they start leaving the roof of the planet, that she's clinging to him. She's saying, oh, I forgot how warm you are. I mean, and I just get the sense from the performance and the scene that he knows that this experience is a close, familiar, intimate experience that they have had in the past. And it strikes me as manipulative on the part of Superman to want to take her on the flight when he could have just stood on the roof and said to her, I hear these people saying it every day that they need a savior, even though you're saying that they don't need a savior, and that they, that's their view of the world. So that seems manipulative to me, especially given the fact that as he has this encounter with her that he's trying to manufacture, I think, she is, if I'm not mistaken, engaged, or at least in a very committed relationship that hasn't gone to marriage yet, with the man that she is telling everyone is the father of her child. And with the man that I think he himself believes is the father of that child. And so Superman then is this outside person that is kind of injecting himself into the middle of an existing committed romantic relationship. And that just doesn't read like Superman to me. He is a gentleman. That doesn't read to me like Superman of the comics or other iterations of the character. On top of that, now this isn't as big of a deal because it's more about Lois's character than Superman's, but Lois would to have been pretty promiscuous, or at least had some kind of one-night stand or something with Richard, hot on the heels of sleeping with Superman, if she is able to convince people that this kid is Richard's son. Those kind of like questions of parentage and stuff, they're only really possible outside of rape. That's only possible when there's promiscuity involved, maybe there's some kind of outlying circumstance that I can't think of at the moment, but it just kind of like inadvertently, I think, paints her in a promiscuous light that I definitely wouldn't want to paint Superman in, but I'm not really thrilled to put Lois in that light either. Also, another thing that just kind of doesn't fit with the past and trying to connect this to past Superman movies is recycling Marlon Brando's material as Jor-El. They try to use his dialogue, especially toward the end in the climax, like Superman hears his father's voice echoing in his mind, saying things that I'm like, is what Jor-El's saying right now supposed to be inspiring Superman in this moment or relevant thematically to this moment and what he's trying to overcome? Because I think it's a bit of a stretch to try and force that connection. Like this is the lesson from Jor-El that needs to be heard, that needs to be meditated on at this moment as we head into the climax. It just seems almost arbitrary and random what is being quoted of Jor-El. Yeah, I also think that Superman as a father, quote unquote, works better in 3 when he's not actually that kid's father. And so for this and many other script/story reasons, I think a full reset of Superman movie continuity would have been more appropriate here, would have been a better fit for me. But some positives. I think that the performances, the supporting cast especially, are great and result in some great comedic moments. The actor playing Jimmy, whose name escapes me at the moment, there's just some great things that he does with his eyes. Like I think of a scene when he's eating a burrito and he hears Richard say something to Lois that kind of like he suspects is going to cause tension between them two, and he just kind of freezes and chews very slowly with very wide eyes. It's just great performance-driven comedic moment. There's another moment where Jimmy is talking to Clark about how Lex Luthor ultimately got out of jail because Superman was gone and didn't appear at a court date, and he's like, can you imagine how much do you think that pisses off Superman? And Clark says, a lot, and so you can read in that performance that, like, of course he is Superman. And so there's just like some great performance elements that bring about some great comedic moments. I love this other moment where Lois is walking with her son Jason onto the yacht that she's realizing something suspicious is happening on. And as they're walking onto the yacht, Jason says to her, "Are we trespassing?" And it just reminds me of some just exchanges between parents and kids, where they're like, you got your kid with you and you're just trying to answer all their questions, but you've got your mind on other things, And so like when he asks, are we trespassing? She says, no. Yes. Shh. I laughed out loud because that just reminded me of just like sometimes things are complex and you just need your child to be quiet. You got your mind. You are frying much bigger fish. So yeah, great little moment like that. As far as Brandon Routh's performance, I thought he was great as Clark. Yes, he's trying to kind of mimic Christopher Reeve a good amount. And you can understand why, just given the whole idea of this project. But he also has his own elements that he's bringing that are unique. And I feel like his Clark is really pretty solid. But his Superman, at least at times, feels sort of put on. And as much as I love Zack Snyder's DC movies and would really hold up Man of Steel as maybe my favorite movie of all time, I will say that there's something similar in Henry Cavill's performance of Superman when he's kind of doing the smiley Superman. I feel like when both Brandon Routh and Cavill are kind of trying to be that just really virtuous man version of Superman, it feels a bit put on compared to Christopher Reeve, who actually felt genuine and earnest when he was having those kinds of moments. And I feel a bit like Routh and Cavill are kind of like doing a thing, like this is how Superman is supposed to be, and so I'm going to be this, instead of it really feeling natural and genuine. So I found that to be the case sometimes in certain moments of Brandon Routh's Superman. The doomed couple that's kind of continued here, where like Lois and Clark, Lois and Superman are not able to be together. Well, the reasons for that are radically changed in this movie, and it changes how I feel about that doomed couple romance, Here in Superman Returns, they are separated by inconvenient relational ties that Lois has to Richard. And I mean, she does actually, I think, love Richard, but at the same time, she's clearly feeling drawn to Superman, but what's keeping them apart? What's keeping them apart is this relationship that she's already in. So the idea, it seems to me, of kind of growing up the Superman mythos and evolving it, making it more grounded and grown up and mature, is to lean into romance and making romance the pivotal thing. And I think this is just one example in 2006, and we've just seen it grow and increase from there, about how romance and sexuality have come to the forefront of stories and define people's identities, their purpose in life, what constitutes a happy ending, all those kinds of things tend to revolve around romantic relational status, And I thought that the reason for this doomed couple being separated was actually, I mean, I was kind of feeling like, yeah, Superman, you should not be getting in the middle of this. This is a messed up situation, but at this point, you shouldn't even be trying to reconnect with Lois. You shouldn't be interfering with this relationship, because that's ultimately all that's at stake, is whether or not these two people have like whether Superman and Lois have a romantic relationship. Whereas before, it's like the reason to not have that relationship is so that Superman can be a rescuer for the entire world. So yeah, it's just not as clear cut that one is a greater good, in Superman Returns. In fact, arguably, him pursuing arguably, yeah. I mean, the greater good is for them to stay separated for the sake of that marriage. But I think the bottom line, the separator between the doomed couple in the original movies and the doomed couple that's kind of playing out in this one, is that the separation here is due to a relationship that Lois is already in, that Superman, I don't think, should be interfering with, and that we shouldn't really be rooting for him to try and disrupt that relationship. And yet that relationship that I don't think Superman should be interfering with, I think we're meant to feel like that's a problem that's going to be fixed in a future film, and probably would have been fixed by Richard dying or something like that, to ultimately bring these two together. I don't know, it just... It just feels messy and pedestrian and below Superman compared to before, where their relationship was not going to work because of the higher good of him needing to be a rescuer for the world. The icing on the cake that kind of just further solidifies how I don't think Superman is being quite like Superman in this movie is admittedly hard to detect when Superman is being beat up by Luthor's thugs because he's weakened by kryptonite. It's unintelligible when you're viewing it, but if memory serves, years ago when I turned on the subtitles to see what is he saying while they're fighting him, he says, "I'm still Superman," even though he's kind of getting the crap kicked out of him. I'm just like, that seems way out of character. Now, admittedly, that's only really intelligible if you put on subtitles, but that would be in the script or in the ad lib or anything at all just says to me, this is weird. This Superman is just not as virtuous here as the Reeve version or as the Henry Cavill version. The Henry Cavill version was somber and he had some angst, but it was all because he was wrestling with trying to do the right thing. And I don't feel like this Superman is wrestling with trying to do the right thing. He is tending to be a little bit more self-serving and self-focused. So it's not really quite the Superman that I know from the comics, from different interpretations in film and other mediums. Yeah, a little disappointing in that regard. Also disappointing. When this movie was the first Superman movie to be made in such a long time, and effects had moved forward so much, I am mystified why they relied so much on CGI replacement of Superman. I'm not just talking about when he was getting batted around or crazy special effects stuff was going on. I'm just talking about some standard flying shots where he was flying by and they chose to do an actor replacement. My eye is cursed to pick this stuff out. And if it wasn't completely CGI made from scratch, then they were so heavily tampering with Brandon Routh footage so as to make it look CG to my eye. There are so many faces of Brandon Routh flying that I'm like, that's CG? What are you doing? What are you doing? And the ways he's moving, I'm like, what are you doing? This is totally unnecessary CG replacement, and it takes me out of the fantasy of seeing a man fly because I'm just seeing a highly detailed computer cartoon flying, you know? Also, the wire work was not as extensive or as impressive as in Superman 3, as I've already kind of said. The shots were just too close in on him to really appreciate him flying seemingly in this open space without a crane or wires anywhere to be seen. That's what makes wire work really impressive to me, is when it's a really wide shot and they just seem to be suspended with nothing around them that could account for them being suspended in midair. Otherwise, my mind can just imagine that there's a crane just over their head, you know, or something. So, yeah, there were overall fewer satisfying Superman moments in this movie compared to the first movie or the third movie. But I do have to say this, despite all the negative things I've been saying about Superman Returns, all of its modern filmmaking advantages that we take for granted, things like intentional shot composition and the way the camera moves and is used, the way that lighting is used, just the overall modern filmmaking quality of Superman Returns made it much more palatable. And it was actually the only Superman film of all these that I've watched that I was content to sit down and watch in one sitting. It took full advantage of surround sound. It took full advantage of contrast in coloring and lighting. And, you know, it was a proper modern cinematic experience, even though modern-ish. I mean, it came out in 2006. But even so, compared to the other Superman movies, this is a modern Superman movie, and it was a satisfying modern movie experience to sit down and watch, even with its flaws for my taste as a Superman movie. So anyway, yeah, really interesting one to sit through. I think that Superman Returns leans hard into the messianic imagery that Richard Donner was going for in his film, but in Superman Returns, it felt like many other things, a tacked on, somewhat forced element to tie it to Richard Donner's movies. And kind of really just kind of a token theme. in comparison, say, to what I found to be the dramatic messianic themes of the Snyder films, which seemed much more meant to evoke emotional connection with the audience and connecting the audience to the theme on an emotional level, rather than here being more of a merely intellectual or philosophical connection to the idea of him being a savior figure. So at the time when the movie came out, I was like, oh, that's cool to see them leaning into that. Wasn't really feeling it much on an emotional level. It wasn't until Man of Steel that I was like, and then Batman versus Superman, that I was like, whoa, now I'm really feeling the emotion of this messianic theme. How much of that was because I had changed as a person versus the movie actually being different, I don't know, but I think a significant amount was because of the movie itself and the different ways that these stories were being told. All right, so I guess in summary, what did I think about this whole experience of going back, watching the Christopher Reeve movies, the Supergirl movie, the Brandon Routh movie that aims to be a part of those Christopher Reeve films? It was a worthwhile experience, mainly because I had time off and plenty of time to kill. I don't think I would have gotten through them near this fast on just a regular work week if I hadn't done this on vacation. I may never watch these movies again without commentary, without going to them to appreciate them on a meta, intellectual, filmmaking, history of the character kind of level. Just as films, I don't know that I would sit down. I mean, some of these I didn't even give my full attention the entire time I sat through them. Some of them I didn't watch them all in one sitting, you know. So I don't know if I'll ever come back to these movies again, or if I do, in what form that will be. I think there's just other things that I'm much more likely to sit down and watch, even just Superman stuff that I'd rather sit down and watch before going back to these movies again, like the Snyder films or the Superman and Lois TV show, you know. So yeah, I kind of doubt I'll ever come back to these movies again for just an enjoyable Superman film experience. But here as I and we look ahead to James Gunn's Superman Legacy, where it's going to be another chance, another shot that Hollywood's going to take at defining this character for a new generation. I think it was worthwhile and a novelty for me to go back and remember what they did with Superman during this, really his most defining era in the cinema. So anyway, I guess those are all of my thoughts for now. As always, love to get yours in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. And I'm grateful, as always, for Spirit Blade, for the, what do you call them, the patrons over at patreon.com/Spirit Blade Productions, for all of their support. You can get more information over there about becoming a patron. Then, as always, I hope you'll check out christiangeekcentral.com, where you can get our podcast and a bunch of other content as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.